Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we have another episode of Adventures in Surplus. This time based on a 1907/15 Berthier rifle that I think has a tremendously interesting story written into all of its various features and marks. So before we dig into some of the details here, let me just give you the basic overview where this thing came from. That is, the French had, of course, developed the Lebel rifle in the 1880s, and by the early 1900s, they'd produced like 3-point-something million of them, enough to supply the entire standing army and the complete war reserve. And at that point, the Lebel ceased production. Instead, the rifle that the French kept manufacturing in small quantities was the Berthier. The Berthier started out as a rifle for the cavalry, and then the gendarmerie and the artillery corps, and it kind of became this catch-all utilitarian rifle for anyone who didn't need a huge full-length Lebel. Well, by 1907, this has expanded to also making the Berthier a rifle for French colonial forces. And they had actually gone so far as lengthening it twice, up to the point where it was the same length as a standard Lebel, because they needed troops for Senegalese. They needed rifles for Senegalese troops who were typically tall, big dudes who were perfectly capable of handling a full-length rifle. But of course, the Lebel was out of production, and it'd be expensive to tool back up to make more Lebels, and they already had the Berthier tooling running, so let's just make a longer Berthier and give it to the Senegalese troops. Now, and this happens, this is a 1907 pattern of rifle, and they're still making them in 1914. Well, of course, in 1914, the Great War breaks out. And the French fairly quickly discover that, wow, they're going to need to put some more rifles into production. This isn't going to be a quick, we're going to be home by Christmas sort of war. This is going to be a grueling grind of a conflict. And the war reserves of Lebels probably aren't actually going to be good enough. And so they look at, what do we have to do to get more rifles into production? We could restart production of the Lebel, but again, we still have this Berthier. It's a less complex gun, it's cheaper to manufacture, and we're already tooled up to make it at two different arsenals. So let's just convert the Berthier. Let's take the Senegalese pattern that's already full-length infantry rifle size. Let's just modify it to give it the same nose cap and bayonet as the Lebel to standardize that, and let's make that a substitute standard infantry rifle. And thus is born the model 1907/15. These go into production in 1915, and there are a couple specific details about the very early ones like this. We actually have a stock date on this one that identifies it as being accepted into military service in September of 1915. So this is a very early 0715 Berthier that was produced barely a year after the Great War began. So let me start showing you some of these details. The cartouche stamped into the stock is a really cool element for the historian or researcher when it comes to these French rifles, because this identifies the exact month and year that the rifle was taken into military service. So this tells us the exact date of the rifle, September 1915. We also have a serial number on the barrel, which confirms that early production. You'll see that this is an F, that is in fact a cursive F, prefix. All of the Berthiers had a letter prefix to the serial numbers, and there were 3 arsenals in operation in France at the time. Each arsenal got a batch of letters to use, so Châtellerault had A through E, and then Saint-Étienne, and this is a Saint-Étienne manufactured rifle, as we can see from the receiver mark here. Well, they got letters F through Q. So they actually produced enough to use up all of those numbers, 100,000 rifles in each letter prefix. After Q, they went back and started doing 2-letter prefixes. So after Q, they went to FG and then FH and so on. In total, it would be something like 2.1 million 1907/15 Berthier rifles made during World War I. Now, a neat feature about this particular one, and in fact about a lot of the early rifles, and keep in mind this is F75,000 means this is about the 75,000th 0715 produced by Saint-Étienne. It is a very early rifle out of the millions that were made. The first handful of them in 1915 were actually made with bent bolt handles like this. That is the same style of bolt handle that was used on the Berthier carbines and the Indochina and the Senegalese colonial pattern rifles. And so when they started production, they just left that the same. However, within a few months, they changed this to a short, stubby, straight bolt handle, basically copying what had been used on the Lebel. So you'll only find these if they're matching, assuming someone hasn't put a carbine bolt into a rifle. You'll only find these on very early 0715s, and that, again, that's just another aspect of what makes this a very early rifle. Now, I said this is a matching rifle, and what we have here is actually a factory rematch, or a factory renumbered bolt. So this was originally F62000, and it has been renumbered 73423, which is the serial number that we see on the other parts. You saw it on the barrel, sorry, 73428, and it's also here on the stock. So what this renumbering indicates is that this rifle was damaged, most likely in combat, in the early stages of the war. The French and the Germans and the British and everyone else would collect up rifles from the battlefield after combat and send them back to depots for repair and refurbishment. This was actually a really important way to conserve guns that otherwise would require complete replacement. And so in the case of rifles like this one that could be repaired by replacing a few parts, that was done. On rifles that were more of a complete loss, whatever parts were still usable were salvaged to be used to repair other guns. So that's what we have here. This is another very early F-pattern gun, or F-series gun, whose bolt was salvaged from a destroyed rifle and used to repair number 73428 here. So they didn't have to restamp the number, they just lined out the old number, added on this rifle's number, and reissued this back into service. But that's not where this rifle's troubles ended for either the rifle or the poor guy carrying it, because we also see here on the left side of the stock this circular stamp. That is a Prussian eagle in the center, and the writing is Deutsches Reich. This is a German basically a German capture mark, or a German property mark. During World War I, the Germans, in fact, captured a lot of French rifles. In fact, everybody captured a lot of weapons from their opponents and put them back into service, typically for rear echelon troops. The idea being you could use a captured French rifle to free up a standard German Gewehr 98 to go to some infantrymen who needed it, rather than having to make a brand new Gewehr 98 for them. And so what we see as evidence of that in World War I is this stamp, which indicates that the gun was inspected and approved for German service. Most of these rifles, virtually, in fact, all of these rifles, were captured in the field in combat. In World War II, you'll see things done a little bit differently, because a lot of the French rifles in German service were captured still in armories or depots after the armistice. And in that situation, the Germans didn't really see the necessity in assessing and overhauling every individual rifle. Whereas if something's picked up off the battlefield, it's important to give it a good looking over and make sure everything's safe to use. So once they had approved them for service, they'd get this stamp. And the one other thing that the Germans typically did was fit a bayonet adapter. It's kind of funny, just like the French modified their colonial pattern Berthier to have a standard Lebel bayonet. Well, the Germans did the same thing, modifying the French rifles they captured to use standard German bayonets. And that bayonet adapter is not on this rifle, but we can see evidence of it in the fact that the original two guide lugs that are fixed on the bottom of a Lebel or Berthier barrel right here, those have been removed. And that's because they have to be removed to fit the German bayonet adapter in place. So that bayonet adapter is an interesting and valuable accessory, and at some point in this rifle's life, it was removed, unfortunately. I'd love to have it for this rifle, but it's not there. But we know it was, because that is the only reason that those guide lugs would be removed. And you can even see a little bit of discoloring where they used to be. We're not done yet with the interesting details on here. Typically, on a Berthier, you would expect on the right side of the barrel to see the manufacturer and date of the barrel. So an arsenal or a private company, both were used. Initially, of course, the French military arms industry supplied all of its own barrels. Each arsenal, Tulle, Châtellerault and Saint-Étienne all produced barrels. And so you would see, say, MAS, Manufacture des Armes de Saint-Étienne, and a date, 1915, is what you would probably expect to see on this rifle. However, early in the war, and this would happen later in the war as well, but when they realized just how many rifles they were going to have to manufacture, they realized that the arsenals couldn't supply enough barrels to keep up with the production that was necessary. And so the French government reached out to commercial enterprises to help. And one of the very first ones that was able to do so was Manufrance. This is basically the civilian gun manufacturing complex at Saint-Étienne. The full name is Manufacture des Armes et Cycles de Saint-Étienne, or the Gun and Bicycle Manufacturing Company of Saint-Étienne. They were kind of like a Sears Roebuck and Company in the United States. They were a mail order firm that made and sold virtually anything you could want through a huge catalog. But they actually produced, in addition to stocking goods from other companies, they also produced their own guns. And so Manufrance was able to supply barrels to the French government, to the French state arsenals fairly quickly. And instead of being dated and marked here, they just have this MF in a circle mark on the top of the receiver. These barrels were also proofed by the commercial proof house, which was located at Saint-Étienne. They, of course, had plenty of experience making and proofing barrels, unlike most of the other contractors that were set up to make barrels later in the war who didn't have any prior experience, and so their barrels would go through military proofing. Well, ones that came from Manufrance could proof those in-house and save a step and save some time for the government. So it's really neat for me to see this sort of emergency, let's reach out to the private industry barrel on this very early, again, like emergency, wow, we're going to need a lot more rifles, let's get something into production, 1907/15. Last but not least, we have an interesting set of marks on both sides of the wrist of the stock here. And I don't want to be overly speculative. I know people are immediately going to jump to the assumption that these are some sort of kill notches. And it's not actually completely out of the realm of possibility that they would be, but I have absolutely no specific evidence to support that. And this is not something you typically see on military firearms. So it's entirely possible that these were added by any number of things, which could be as blasé as the child of a previous owner in the 1960s playing with the gun and hammering some marks into it until their father saw it and got pissed off and told them to stop it. That sort of thing happens. So we can't make any assumptions about these, but I figured I'd point them out because, well, they are here. They're mirrored on both sides of the stock, and I don't know specifically what they are. And last but not least, we know that this rifle was out of French military service before World War II. Specifically, we know it was out of military service before 1932, because it was at that point that the French started marking N on barrels and receivers when they reamed out rifle chambers to accept the new pattern of 8mm Lebel cartridge. So there's no N marking, which means this rifle was not in French service in the early 1930s. Almost certainly this rifle came back, probably to the United States, as a souvenir with an American soldier at the end of the war. Whether it was acquired from a French soldier or from a German prisoner, we have no way of knowing. There's nothing on the rifle that indicates how long it was in French service, if it was returned, if it was basically recaptured from the Germans by the French. But what we do know is that we've got a rifle here that was, I think, one of the most interesting patterns of World War I, in that this is the very beginning of French rifle production going into the war because they know they're going to need a lot more rifles. And this gun exemplifies the fact that they were going to need more rifles because it was both damaged in combat and repaired with a donor bolt from another gun. And then it was lost a second time to German capture and modified and used by the German military for an unknown period of time before being either recaptured by the French or recaptured by an American soldier in the hands of a German captive or in a German depot. I think this rifle is a fantastic example of how you can see an entire story of a rifle and all sorts of interesting twists and turns just through the surviving characteristics and markings of a single rifle like this. We don't know anything about who might have had this, we don't know a name, we don't know where it was, but we can still tell a tremendous amount about what this rifle went through. And I think that's one of the really cool, really fascinating aspects of military rifle collecting, military firearms collecting. So hopefully you guys also enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.